This is a fictionalized narrative inspired by public information and public perception. It is not a statement of fact about any real events or individuals. What if the greatest empire you ever built was founded on a secret you could never reveal, one, not of illegality or scandal, but of a private vow you made to the darkness itself, that every comfort would be traded, every tenderness mortgaged, every future memory sold for speed? Imagine that vow humming in the fluorescent hum of a garage at night, when the monitors glow like twin moons and the cursor blinks like a metronome counting down a life. Picture a man alone at a makeshift desk made from a hollow core door laid on metal legs, the kind of desk that prophesies thrift-fueled thunder. Outside, the rain needles the asphalt. Inside, he whispers shipment codes like prayers, and the warehouse that doesn't yet exist thunders in his mind. He believes the world is a sum of systems, and that systems are promises you calibrate, promises you measure, promises you keep. Before the glass towers and orbiting headlines, before the vans painted with a lowercase smile and the blue arrows that implied everything could arrive if you only clicked, there was a yellow legal pad, a column of numbers, and a belief that the future belonged to whoever arrived first and never stopped arriving. He called it Day One, not as a brand of perpetual youth, but as a sentence handed down to himself. Wake, build, obsess, sleep, repeat. He had the smile of someone watching a storm. He ordered on an app only he could see. Beneath that smile, hunger like a turning gear. In the earliest days, nothing worked until everything worked. Modems hissed, servers coughed. The world's inventories hid in tens of thousands of small rooms. A plan was simple and arrogant. Map the messy abundance of humans and compress it into something that could be summoned with a click. Books were first because books were clean. They had numbers, names, metadata, but the plan was never books. The plan was impulse and inevitability. The plan was to place logistics on a leash and teach it to heel at your door. Each small victory arrived with a tiny price nobody saw. A promise to be faster was a promise to be harder. A pledge to lower prices was a pledge to move pressure out of sight. Someone always paid. Sometimes that someone was him, the founder who removed the cushions from his life and sat on the cold concrete of ambition. Sometimes it was those who fastened their days to conveyor belts and scanning guns, whose names the system stored as line items in a ledger that could be searched but not truly seen. He believed in mechanisms because mechanisms could be improved, and he believed in improvement because improvement could be measured, and he believed in measurement because measurement could be optimized until even the human pulse looked like a variable you could model. The ascent looked clean from the outside, like a chart that knew only one direction. In boardrooms smelling of new carpet, he drew flywheels on whiteboards and watched the people in the room lean forward as if the circle itself generated wind. Lower prices brought more customers. More customers attracted more sellers. More sellers expanded selection. Expanded selection improved the experience. The experience pulled in more customers. And around the circle they flew. It was a liturgy for the modern market faith expressed in velocity. He was their priest, the cleric of frictionlessness. And when the chart lines curved upward like a smile, no one asked if the smile knew what it meant to be a face. But you can't climb forever without wondering what lives at the summit. So he kept building, warehouses that inhaled products and exhaled packages, software that predicted desire with unsettling precision, devices that listened because they were asked to listen, or because listening was their nature. He launched cloud servers to rent the storm he'd learned how to harness, and soon entire economies ran on rented weather. He sent rockets to lay claim to the sky, as if the atmosphere were just another warehouse without walls. Reporters called it audacity. Rivals called it domination. He called it Tuesday. His secrets were not cinematic, not the sort that fit neatly into headlines with ringing gongs. They were smaller and more corrosive. the private knowledge that if he ever slowed down, the machine would forget him, and the crowd at the base of his mountain would begin to climb in his place. The secret that empire demands a kind of abstinence from ordinary life, no indulgent afternoons, no leisurely middles. He had traded middles for edges, traded enough for again, traded home for a sequence of windows in which the sun never really set because markets never really sleep. He was not cruel, not exactly. He was precise. Precise people become terrifying when the thing they are measuring is you. In meetings, the air thinned around the numbers. If a project hesitated, he would find the variable nobody had calculated and pry it like a stone in a jammed gear. He asked for the truth, and the truth obeyed the math. When the math told him to cut, he cut. When the math told him to enter a new market, he entered it like a blade enters paper. And when he laughed, it was with the relief of someone who discovered that alignment between the world and the model was possible. At least for a moment, if you bent both hard enough, people told stories about him because the scale required stories. They said he could see in dashboards the way a pilot sees in clouds, without panic, without nostalgia. They said his favorite word was customer, and that the word was a shield that turned any wound into a lesson. They said he loved experiments the way some people love risks, because experiments were risks that apologized afterward. They said he slept little and walked fast and had a spine made of deadlines. Most of the stories were true because they needed to be, because empires are made of narratives you can execute. The first breaks in the glass weren't visible from the street. They were audible in the way laughter changed pitch around him. They were tactile in the way silence began to feel like a second skin at the end of day-long war rooms. He was older now, and the engines he'd built no longer needed him to breathe for them. They breathed on their own, exhaling quarterly reports and regulatory letters and news cycles that were more weather than events. Scrutiny arrived because scale is a siren for it. Questions sharpened because hard questions are the rent you pay when you become the architecture of how people live. In the mirror at dawn, he saw the artifact of his vow, the cost ledger inscribed on his face in the same lines and margins that once held the legal pad. He saw the watchfulness that had served him, a merciless shepherd of attention, now circling back to ask for its fee. He thought of all the doors he had opened metaphorically, algorithmically, in all the doorframes he had planed himself in those first years, and he wondered which door he had walked through last that still had his name etched into the jamb. There were conflicts, of course. Growth is a feast with many knives. Competitors who called themselves collaborators until the bill arrived. Partners who wanted the shine without the gravity. Politicians who wanted the photo without the policy. There were moments when the company felt like a city whose tax code he had to rewrite every night. There were letters to employees, polished and careful, where he tried to translate the curvature of space-time into sentences about mission and responsibility. There were public storms and private weather. Some days he held the umbrella. Some days he was the umbrella. The risk of building an empire that answers to a smiling arrow is that the arrow points forward even when you want to stop. A brand promises direction. You become the act of moving. He envied stillness the way the thirsty envy rain. He envied ordinary errands. He envied the garden he never planted because scheduled sunlight felt like a failure. He envied the soft regularity of weekends the way a sailor envies land, and then he despised the envy because envy wastes speed. He tried to keep the other vows too, the ones whispered to friendships, to partnerships, to versions of himself that existed only in photographs, but the machine was jealous. It wanted attention the way fire wants oxygen. He gave it, and when he turned away, it coughed and called his name in the voice of 1,000 notifications. Some mornings he found himself touching his phone before he touched the daylight. Some nights he slept with the screen still breathing beside him, as if the empire were a child who needed watching. There were betrayals, but not the glamorous kind. They were mutual and incremental. He betrayed his patients by indulging in patience. Others betrayed his trust by treating his urgency as a wall to decorate with half-truths. He watched people learn to speak in a dialect of performance, accuracy sanded into acceptability. He tried to burn that language out of the halls. Sometimes he succeeded. Sometimes the smoke smelled like victory. Sometimes it smelled like the curtains. The secret, if there was one, was not that he aimed to win at all costs, but that he never decided where winning ended. The finish line was always deferred, always replaced by a more elegant concept: optionality, adjacency, ecosystem. He built rings around rings until even the circles got dizzy. In quiet moments, he asked himself if the platform owned him as surely as he owned it. When he stepped down from the day-to-day throne, he told the world the move would give him room to invent, to explore, to lift his eyes. The world nodded, wrote headlines, edited the photo until it gleamed. Inside, he wondered if stepping down meant stepping into a room with mirrors on all sides. The ascent had made him fluent in beginnings. Nobody had taught him how to end. He could iterate a prototype into a pillar of civilization. He could not iterate a farewell. He could hire 1,000 engineers and make the cloud itself kneel, but he could not hire anyone to take the weight of what he had chosen to carry off his chest and place it gently on the floor. The world kept ordering. The vans kept moving. The servers kept humming their lullabies for other people's dreams. In those twilight hours that belonged to insomniacs and founders, he sometimes pictured a store that sold nothing. A store that delivered silence to your door in 2 days or less. He wondered what it would cost. He wondered if anyone would click. You cannot be the richest man in the room without becoming a rumor to yourself. He learned to regard his own face the way he regarded metrics, a changing value. He learned that power is a drug that insists it is a vitamin. He learned that scale brings scrutiny, not because the world hates winners, but because winners become weather, and weather is what shepherds call the sky when it cannot be trusted. One night, in a house with more rooms than a life could require, he walked past the threshold, where a doorframe still bore the faint dent of a younger man's shoulder. He paused, thumbed the indentation as if it were a fossil of momentum. He wanted to ask the groove a question. When did building turn into atonement? He closed his eyes. He saw the early monitors blinking. He heard the rain. He remembered the vow to trade anything for speed. Then he felt the shape of something slower elbow up through the dark. Not regret, not pride, but the plain fact that nothing he had shipped could ship him back to the moments he'd spent to make it all arrive. Posso continuer comma proxima part? He stood in the quiet and waited for the house to answer. Houses built by ambition answer in echoes. They return the sounds you bring them, multiplied by volume and time. The echo came back as a catalogue of rooms he never learned to inhabit, and for a second he almost laughed. The empire had taught him to allocate attention like currency, and yet attention, unlike money, cannot be saved, only spent or squandered. He walked toward the window. The city outside pulsed like a grid of veins. Somewhere below, a van's sliding door shut, soft as a period at the end of a sentence written at speed. In the months after stepping back, he learned what silence was not. It was not the absence of noise. The machines would never hush. The charts would never sleep. It was a different muscle, a slow curiosity turned inward. He tried hobbies with the diligence he once applied to supply chains. Read the manuals, hire the coach, schedule the repeatable practice. The hobbies obeyed, but obedience was not the point. He built because building was how he prayed. The rockets kept rising, and the sky kept looking both close and far, a negative of the cloud that had made his fortune. Propellant replaced price elasticity. Rendezvous windows replaced quarterly quarters. Space was older and more stubborn than any market, and he liked that. He liked meeting something he could not negotiate into behaving. Yet even in the vacuum of those launches, the sound of the past traveled. He read articles, some cutting, some fair, that asked whether the empire had been too hungry, too fast, too bladed. He met with people who spoke in the mournful grammar of experience, stories of warehouses, of bruised wrists and blistering quotas, of bathrooms too far away, and algorithms that saw only throughput. He listened, and he did not interrupt. You can be the author of a mechanism and still be surprised by what it asks of the human body. You can optimize a route and forget that miles have weight. He began to understand that his vow to speed had been perfectly honest and disastrously incomplete. It neglected the dimension that refuses arithmetic, meaning. Meaning cannot be shipped by the pallet or tucked into a bubble mailer. Meaning arrives freighted with context, with time spent rather than saved, with names that cannot be indexed into codes. In the engine room of that dawning, he felt something rattle loose, and the sound made him still. In boardrooms with different ceilings, he spoke about responsibility and systems, as if the words were levers. He meant them. He was a builder. Accountability had to be expressed in fixtures and fittings, not just in statements. He asked for better data about human fatigue, not to neutralize it, but to respect it. He asked for managers to hold metrics and faces in the same hand. Some changes stuck. Others were absorbed by the inertia of a continent-sized organization, whose river he had first traced with a pencil and now watched from a cliff. People wanted a spectacle, a fall that thudded, a crown that rolled, a confession that bled. The reality was slower and more human. It was a man who had outclimbed the map, learning how to stand still without falling over. It was the gradual recognition that supremacy and sufficiency are twins who never speak. It was seeing that his genius for scale had starved his talent for smallness, and that the cure for starvation is not to invent a larger meal. On a morning that began unspectacularly, coffee cooling on a too-long table, email lined up like soldiers, he opened an old folder of photos. The garage, of course. The door desk. The smiles that were not yet armor. He lingered on a photo of himself, holding the first printed sign of a company whose name had once been an idea, then a bet, then a pulse felt in a million pockets at once. In the picture, his eyes were both electrified and unafraid of empty rooms. He remembered the texture of that air, the kind of hope that feels like hunger but leaves you lighter after eating. He set the photo down and wrote a note first by hand, then as a letter he would not send. In it he admitted to a truth most founders must eventually hold like a blade by the dull side, that survival and salvation are not the same. He had survived every market winter and drafted his own weather forecast, but salvation belongs to different arithmetic. It begins by subtracting yourself from the center of the story you made inevitable and adding back the people who walked its corridors. It recognizes that empires, like libraries, are only as good as the quiet they grant to those who read. The world kept asking him to be symbolic. Symbols digest well. They can be printed, debated, praised, or scorned. He agreed to the symbol making because he understood that all power eventually becomes a myth others must learn to use. But he set aside something unsymbolic for himself, the habit of walking the long way to the coffee machine, through a hallway of framed patents, to hear if the building still sang. He had once tuned that song to a frequency only he could hear. Now he listened for dissonance he had trained himself to ignore. Sometimes he heard it, sometimes he did not. Either was an answer. In interviews, he said the right things with the right rhythm. He talked about obligation and delight, about climate and customers, about the long view. The cadence was practiced, but not false. Privately, he tested a more vulnerable doctrine, that the meaning of a life is not equivalent to the size of its outputs. He was rich beyond counting, and yet discovered that counting remained his most intimate reflex, and habits this intimate are loyal enemies. He visited a warehouse late one night, unannounced and nearly unseen. The floor lights strobed in tidy intervals. Robots traced paths like hungry constellations. Workers moved with choreographies written by constraint and necessity. He stood on a mezzanine and watched a woman scan, lift, place, exhale, scan, lift, place, exhale. Her concentration was a cathedral. He wanted to replace something that made her work heavier with something that made it lighter and new, with a pang that mimicked gratitude. How easily that desire could be turned into a promise he would not live long enough to track to the ground. He went home with the rhythm of her breath in his head, and it played there, stubborn, a metronome that measured not units per hour, but human hours per unit of progress. He wondered, as leaders must when their reflection refuses to sign the old contracts, whether the most meaningful invention left to him was not a rocket or a new market, but a different appetite, one that treated enough as more than a theory. Consequences arrive the way winter does, by degrees that fool you until a morning comes when the grass is glazed. Friends who had lived in the vestibule of his calendar drifted away, not bitter but resigned, like commuters who finally move closer to their station. Partnerships loosened. Loyalties recalibrated themselves to lives that deserved their full names. He had asked for this, though not in words. The empire had a gravity field. Anything held too near it eventually became a satellite or a streak of heat. There was shame sometimes, but not the public kind. He reserved it for the private arithmetic of what he could have done differently had he believed earlier that velocity and mercy could be taught to hold hands. He kept the shame quiet because it worked better that way, like a weight you wear under your clothes to remind your muscles to stand up straight. There was also pride because what he had built had lifted millions into a daily convenience that felt like infrastructure, and because dissenting from his own success when it fell short of his conscience, however late, still mattered. On a day unworthy of a headline, he walked to a river that had once named a company and now named a realization. That flow is not the point. Confluence is. The river did not ask him to rename it. It asked him to sit. He sat. He thought about the first package he had ever taped shut with his own hands, and about the last one he would never see, out there in the world, ripped open by someone who needed something now. He realized that the human present is always emergency-shaped, and that he had made a life of answering that shape with speed. He wondered what it would mean to answer it with depth. There is no spectacular fall here, no operatic collapse to tidy the narrative. There is only a man stepping through rooms toward a smaller voice he once postponed in favor of louder triumphs. He does not vanish into disgrace or ascend into sainthood. He discovers instead the long middle he once traded away, mornings that do not begin with dashboards, afternoons that can be misspent without strategy, evenings that do not need to be justified by output. He practices. He fails. He practices again. In the end, if we must use that ambitious word, he looks across the roofs of a city that he helped rewire and understands that justice, in the realm of empires, is not a gavel but a gravity. Every choice returns with interest. Some of his returns as love, some as convenience, some as scrutiny, some as quiet reckonings in rooms without witnesses. He is not ruined. He is not redeemed. He is held to account by the very scale that once guarded him, and he accepts that as the only closing argument he can respect. The moral, whispered because shouting would be indecent, is this: you can conquer the world by speeding it up, but you cannot escape yourself except by slowing down where it hurts. The empire arrives in 2 days or less. The person takes as long as the truth requires. And in that unhurried economy, the arrows on all your boxes point not forward but inward, toward a space you cannot ship to anyone else, a warehouse of uncounted hours where the only inventory that matters is the courage to change what cannot be automated. He did not plan for the moment when the lights would feel interrogational, but there he was, under a row of indifferent bulbs, the long table stretching to either side like a runway for words that wouldn't quite take off. Committee members spoke in careful crescendos. Cameras blinked in the eyes of strangers. It wasn't a trial, and it wasn't a celebration. It was the kind of public room where power is measured not in applause, but in the patience of those asking the questions. He answered with the same instruments that built the empire, clarity, precision, the trust fall of numbers, and watched his sentences become headlines as they left his mouth. He was not surprised by the questions. He was surprised by the way his own answers sounded when played back through a nation's speakers. Efficient, correct, unforgiving. Afterward, the car closed around him with its curated quiet. The city's noise smeared across the windows. He thought about the engine of scale, the one he had tuned to sing in unison, from warehouses to websites to homes or packages whispered onto doormats like low tide. The engine was real. It had lifted an economy's floorboards. It had also, he admitted this now, without flinching, taught him to treat friction like a sin instead of a teacher. On the drive, he checked messages that translated the hearing into analytics. Impact, sentiment, trend lines. He closed the tablet. The numbers were honest. They were not complete. He decided to visit the door desk. In a glass case inside a lobby designed to erase doubt, the makeshift desk sat like an artifact rescued from the myth. A plaque beneath it praised thrift and ingenuity. Tourists took photos the way pilgrims touch stone. He waited until the hour thinned, then asked the guard to open the case. The hinges protested a little, as if history were allowed to creak. He ran a palm over the surface. It felt cheap and determined. It felt like all the early bets, ugly until they worked. He remembered the first week he'd built it, the screws hovering just shy of straight, the way the door flexed when he leaned too hard. He remembered drawing the first flywheel in a notebook stolen from a different life. He remembered the people who had gathered around that wobbling altar and offered their years to an unproven hypothesis that convenience could be a kind of civic infrastructure if built with fanatic patience. Some of them were still here. Others had shed the company like a skin and gone on to build their own engines. He found their names in his mind like bookmarks. He wanted to call each of them and ask, what did we get right? What did we get wrong? He took his hand off the wood and let the case close. He scheduled a trip he would not publicize. The jet rose into a sky he had once promised to rent to the rest of the world. Banking over rivers and roads, he turned into logistics. He landed in a city that knew him only as a logo on trucks. The warehouse at the edge of town glowed like a well-lit argument. He walked with a small entourage, no speeches, no photographers, through doors that inhaled him into the rhythm. Conveyor belts pulsed, lifts chirped, robots traced their elegant geometry. People moved inside the clockwork, each gesture precise enough to be measured and personal enough to be unrepeatable. He approached a station where a man in his 40s loaded oblong things into squared holes that called themselves bins. The man wore the fatigue of someone whose body is paid by the hour and whose mind is not allowed to wander far. The name on his badge was Miguel. The founder asked if he could watch for a while. Miguel nodded and did not stop moving. Minutes passed, then more. The founder asked what made a night long. Miguel said, without bitterness, when the target changes after lunch. The founder nodded, a small nod, almost invisible, and asked what made a night short. Miguel smiled, this time with a light that had nothing to do with bulbs, and said, when the supervisor says good job before the numbers do. After that, he found himself wandering the mezzanine, where air goes first after being heated by effort. The view made his chest feel full and hollow at once. He had built something that worked like weather, predictable enough to plan a life around, forceful enough to ruin a day when it changed without warning. He had called this miracle. He now recognized the parts of it that were simply gravity. He could alter gravity at the edges, install more rest, more humanity, more listening, but he could not rewrite the law without collapsing the sky. He stood there and practiced the hardest part of power, telling the truth to himself in a sentence he could live with. He left the warehouse after midnight, the clock insisting it was tomorrow. In the hotel he didn't need, but rented anyway, he wrote 2 letters. One for the board, sober and administrative, outlining investments in ergonomics, time studies that looked at humans first, a tolerance for slower rollouts when slower would save bodies. The other letter he did not send. It was addressed to a younger version of himself and began, "You are right about speed. You are wrong about what it's for." When the rockets called again, he answered, because some callings are simply the shape of your breath. He stood at the base of metal that dreamed of stars and felt, as he always did, the good kind of smallness, the kind that discipline teaches, not that humiliation imposes. Space insisted on humility more reliably than markets. Markets could be coaxed. Space could not. As engines lit and tremors shook the sand, he remembered the warehouse's choreography. He wondered if the exhaust plumes in the forklift lanes were somehow part of the same sentence he'd been writing since the garage. A sentence about distance and time, and the human appetite to close one and stretch the other. A small failure occurred on a scent-nothing catastrophic, a valve that sang the wrong note. The craft returned dozy but intact. Cameras recorded it with less hunger than they once had, because novelty grows old like everything. In the debrief, he listened to a young engineer describe a thermal margin that had been respected and a procedural step that would be edited. He loved the engineer for loving the truth. He also understood something he hadn't in earlier years, that procedures are cathedrals built from human attentions, and attention, like faith, cannot be mandated. It must be invited. He made a note to change a checklist, not by adding steps, but by adding space where a person could look up and see the machine as a partner and not just a demand. He began to visit homes he owned as if they belonged to someone else. He stood on decks and in kitchens and in the cold mechanical rooms where houses hide their beating hearts. He took inventory not of art or furniture, but of silence. Where was it intact? Where was it broken? He realized his properties were immaculate, and in their immaculate way, uninhabited by anything messy enough to qualify as joy. He hosted a dinner with no speech, no agenda. A violinist he loved sat in as a friend. Conversation turned not to ventures, but to moments. A teacher who had changed someone's mind. A son who had forgiven a father for being absent at a science fair. A woman who had kept a small business alive by inventing a new pastry during a winter that crushed others. He listened as if he were learning a new market, and perhaps he was. People kept wanting to read the story in a binary grammar. Rise, fall, hero, villain. Justice as spectacle. Karma as clip. He refused the grammar, even when it would have been easier to feed it. He took responsibility where he could, and declined performance where it would turn into absolution by applause. He learned to write checks without writing press releases. He learned to say, "I don't know," in rooms where "I know" had been his signature. He learned that the most radical sentence an empire can teach itself is, "We can afford to go slower here." The machine did not collapse. It adapted slowly, then faster, like all machines that want to keep living. A percentage point of throughput was sacrificed to a redesign of stations that made wrists happier. A policy changed so the target could not change after lunch. Managers learned to measure 2 things at once, numbers and names. Not everywhere, not everyone, not a miracle, but a motion in the right direction. He would not see the full arc of it. That was a younger man's arrogance, that all seeds must be harvested by the one who plants them. He accepted that you plant for a future you might never meet. On a long run by the river that had baptized his company long before it baptized his understanding, He counted his steps without counting them. The air was sharp. A child on a scooter flared past, her bell too cheerful for the gray morning. He watched her outrun a dog that considered chasing and that opted for dignity instead. He laughed, not at anything, just at the world happening exactly as it wanted without his interference. He wondered when he had last laughed like that. He stopped, put hands on hips the way bodies do when asking for mercy from lungs, and looked at the water. It moved with a confidence that asked nothing of him. He let it pass. He began carrying a small notebook again, not for KPIs or plans, but for sentences that landed uninvited. One read, "Friction is how the universe keeps us in conversation." Another, "A good system saves effort. A good life knows what effort to spend." Another, written in the crooked script of a plane that had just hit weather, "Speed without direction is abrasion." He did not share the notebook in interviews. He did not workshop the lines. He used them like anchors in winds that otherwise would have pulled him back to the old vow. A private grief arrived quiet, as grief often does when it doesn't want to be a headline. It had nothing to do with business. It had to do with time. The grief made him smaller, which is different from making him weak. He took a week off from everything, a concept he had once treated like a myth reported by less ambitious people. During that week, he organized drawers, a task he had silently mocked in others. He found an unmailed letter from those early days, a thank you to a supplier who had extended terms when they were not yet worth the risk. He mailed it, decades late, exactly on time. When he returned, he invited a group of employees from across the empire to a room that had been used for strategy and would now be asked to host listening. The group included a robotics lead, a warehouse picker, a call center rep, a data scientist, a last-mile driver, and a woman who had joined just out of high school and now trained others to scan without paying. He asked one question: "What is the thing you are proudest of that most people never see?" The driver said, "I know which customers hate the doorbell because of their dogs." The scientist said, "I turned an algorithm off because it was right for the numbers and wrong for the people." The picker said, carefully, because honesty is a muscle too, "I taught my son that good work can be quiet." He wrote these down, not to frame them, but to remember that the empire had a soul, and it lived in details no dashboard could display. He grew gentler with those who criticized him from a distance, even when they were wrong in specifics and right in spirit. He stopped making the old mistake of assuming his intent guaranteed their outcome. He learned to ask for second drafts of policies the way he once asked for second drafts of pitches. He caught himself saying, "I was wrong," in a room where once he would have said, "Let's test it." Sometimes he still said, "Let's test it." He was not reinvented. He was adjusting. On an evening tilted toward winter, he stood again at a window and watched one of his vans nose into a cul-de-sac. The driver stepped out and moved with the competence of someone who owned his route, the way a farmer owns his land, with respect, with annoyance, with love. A porch light bloomed. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a keyboard clicked in the constant night where customer wishes become databases. He felt a sensation that didn't have a word in business. Gratitude unhooked from victory. He said nothing. The room was empty. It was enough. People still asked. In the elastic way, people ask questions they want to answer themselves, whether he had fallen. He had not in the operatic sense. He had shed certain illusions and paid certain debts and acknowledged that scale is a mirror that enlarges not just the best of you, but the worst. He had once told the world that day two is stasis, a line that had circulated through culture like a proverb. He now saw that day two also offered a mercy, the chance to learn stillness without surrender, to edit vows, to place a comma where you once insisted on a dash. If there is a moral here, and morals are dangerous when handed out like coupons, it is modest. A life can be a masterpiece of execution and still miss the point if the object executed is too small. The secret is not a scandalous file waiting to be leaked. The secret is a sentence you write late at night in a hand nobody will ever read. I built a system. Now I will try to be a person. The consequences are not theatrical. They are daily and durable. They look like a supervisor saying good job before the numbers do. They look like a target that does not change after lunch. They look like a founder who can walk through a warehouse and feel, not the thrum of domination, but the harmony of labor that does not steal from the future to pay for the present. He will never renounce the part of himself that believes in speed. He knows hurricanes of attention waste lives. He knows people stand taller when time is returned to them quickly. He also knows, now, that speed ought to serve the human pace, not replace it. He cannot unmake the past. He can shelter the future. He can require, in meetings where the air thins around numbers, that someone read aloud a story of a driver who learned which doorbell to avoid because of a dog. Late one night, he returned to the door desk. No guard this time, just a key and a quiet. He set a new plaque beside the old one, small enough that most eyes would miss it. The plaque read, "This door was once a desk. Now it is a reminder. Build what works. Remember who it should work for." He turned off the light. He let the building keep singing. He walked out into a city knit together by roots he had helped draw and breathed air he had not optimized. Somewhere, a package arrived just when it should. Somewhere else, a supervisor said good job. Somewhere else, a child pressed a scooter bell and outran a dog who forgave her. The empire moved. The man stood still long enough to feel it move without him. For the first time in a very long time, it felt less like loss and more like design. In the morning, before email and meetings and the endless mercy of things that must be done, he wrote one more line in the notebook. Legacy is not what keeps working when you leave. Legacy is why the people left behind wanted to. He closed the book. He stepped into his day like a human being flawed, practiced, learning. And the arrow that had always pointed forward did not change its shape, but he finally understood its destination. It did not aim at more. It aimed at better.